So Omar, you wrote a piece for us at Newsweek in which you disputed the idea that Ben-Gvir, this racist terrorist who is now part of Benjamin Netanyahu's ruling coalition, represented a break from the status quo of Israeli politics and was more sort of, in line with what you see as a central tenet of Israel, its governing and its relationship with the Palestinians. Walk us through that argument.
Sure. I don't want to downplay the extent to which it is dangerous to have people like Ben-Gvir holding security positions, because that is quite risky. And I think that we might see the consequences of that at some point in the near future. But if you look at the context from which Ben-Gvir emerged, just look at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who said that Israel is not a country of all of its citizens, but specifically of the Jewish population. You see the Prime Minister before him, Yair Lapid, who says we need to build the wall to get the Arabs out of our sight. And then you have the Prime Minister before him, Naftali Bennett, who says that there is nothing wrong with killing Arabs. Those are three different prime ministers in a row from three different parties in Israel. So it's quite clear that anti-Palestinian racism is mainstream in Israeli politics. And Batya, worse than the politics and political discourse is policy itself. Now, every major human rights organization in the world, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and the United Nations, all agree that Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians. That means that Israel denies millions of Palestinians freedom and human rights for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. And in that political context, having somebody like Ben-Gvir emerge is simply a natural continuation of Israeli political discourse and policy as well towards Palestinians. And it's frankly a scandal that the United States, talking about not wanting to engage with Ben-Gvir, they should not be engaging with the Israeli government entirely until the system of apartheid falls.
So Shany, you spent your whole life thinking about democracy, worrying about democracy, thinking about it in depth in the Israeli context and elsewhere. I want to give you a chance to respond to what Omar said and to tell us how you see this new government.
Well, a new government hasn't been formed yet, and there's not a coalition yet. It's likely that Ben-Gvir and his party will be in the coalition, but it's not for sure. I definitely see his arrival in the coalition and his success in the recent election as something that's deeply disconcerting for all the obvious reasons. I would say that the roughly 10% of the population that voted for him, that voted for an openly racist and rather illiberal and anti-democratic worldview, has existed in the parliamentary elections in Israel throughout, and in fact in other countries as well. In most parliamentary systems in the West, there is at least a 10% of a far-right vote with views that most of us would consider quite unsavory. One of the things that happens in a conflict situation, particularly in a conflict situation governed by the rules of social media, is that anything that's a worst case from the other side becomes, for its opponents and its enemies, emblematic. So social media will always be full of posts that people salivate over, of people from one side of the conflict doing or saying something absolutely outrageous. I was a bit struck by the three quotes that Mr. Badar gave right now, because all three of them circulate quite a bit on social media. They're all three ripped completely from context, in many cases meaning the exact opposite. The Lapid quote is from a statement of Lapid about the importance of withdrawing from the territories. The Netanyahu quote continues the next sentence about the importance of equal rights for everyone. It rejects the slogan of state for all its citizens, which internal Israeli politics is used as a description of a non-Jewish state. And even the Bennett quote is taken from, I'm not even going to get into it, but from a radically different context. These are the rules governing social media, but it's not actually how the dispute and how the reality has been lived in Israel. That is not at all to minimize the danger of Ben-Gvir or to minimize the gravity of his worldview or its radical incompatibility with most of what has been the legacy and the tradition of Israeli democracy. The moment that he's entering the government, something which looks likely, is, like I said, a concerning moment for everyone. But it is, in a partial sense at least, quite a rupture. In an electoral sense, like I said, not as big of a rupture as we'd perhaps like to think. There has consistently been a minority of far right-wing, illiberal, anti-democratic voters in Israel, not terribly different from in other countries. The one difference in Israel is that because of the situation in the occupied territories, and particularly the civilian presence in the occupied territories, there is a place to act out much of this illiberal and anti-democratic fantasy, where in other countries, far-right, illiberal, anti-democratic types have at most a couple websites and aggressive tweeters.
Right. So that I wanted to ask you this, Omar, and also give you a chance to respond to everything Shany just said. But to what extent do you think Israeli democracy within, the borders of Israel proper is something that is different than what is happening in the occupation of the West Bank, where, of course, I think we could all agree there's a situation there that's not democratic, but that is, at least from the Israeli point of view, supposed to be temporary. To what extent do you recognize the democracy of Israel proper towards its Arab Israeli citizens who have 95, 96, 97% of the same rights as Israeli Jewish citizens?
Sure. Just to respond to the earlier comments real quick, I'll note that Benjamin Netanyahu also warned during one of his campaigns about Arabs voting in droves as a way to get Jewish voters to also turn out. So and Naftali Bennett also has a very extensive racist history. I think people should go and look at these quotes in context for themselves and decide what they actually mean. On the question of the difference between Israeli democracy within Israel's borders as recognized by the UN and the occupied territories, I do think there is a difference. Palestinian citizens of Israel are merely second-class citizens. They enjoy many of the rights that every Israeli enjoys, with many limits on who they can marry, what neighborhoods they can live in, on Palestinian refugees being able to return, and they can't because they're not Jewish. I mean, there is plenty of systemic discrimination, but I agree that it's a drastic departure from the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where millions of Palestinians live under Israeli control and they don't get to participate in these elections. They frankly have no rights at all. People in Gaza can't interact with the outside world because of Israel's siege on Gaza. At some point, Israel was not even allowing certain foods into Gaza, like potato chips and cookies and soda pop and so on. You're talking about a population that is living completely within the confines of what Israel allows them to exist as. And in the West Bank, it's the same. Traveling from one Palestinian town to another, you can't do it without passing through an Israeli checkpoint. So by any measure, you are talking about a population that is living completely under the control of Israel, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. So in the case of Palestinian citizens of Israel, we can speak of discrimination. And in the case of Palestinians in the occupied territory, you can speak of complete denial of rights. And the fact that President Biden refers to this as a free and fair election, I think should be a scandal. In any other context in which a country systematically discriminates against a huge segment of the population simply because of who they are and what their ethnic and religious background is, we would not call that a democracy. It is apartheid, and it's way belated. It's way about time for the United States government to actually come around to recognize what every major human rights organization in the world has recognized.
Yeah, so Shany, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that, and then also a question. Donald Trump, claimed to be the most pro-Israel president ever. How will Netanyahu's relationship with Joe Biden, what will that look like?
I can answer the second question first, if you want. Netanyahu and Joe Biden are longtime friends. Both of them have a not terribly different view of the main interests that their countries have in the in the larger Middle East, and on the Iran issue, and on the room for what is possible in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. I don't think that should be, in the short term, a terribly difficult relationship. But there are some real differences, and in particular, both of them represent domestic coalitions in one way or another, with some very divergent views on a few really important issues. But I don't see any real fireworks in there. Do you want me to respond to the other things?
Yes, please.
Please do.
All right. Well, there were two categories of the things that were said, and one was regarding in Israel, and one was regarding in the territories. And again, a lot of these talking points are rehashed and well-worn, but there's nothing really behind them in any comparison with any other country or in any proper legal regime. This idea that refugees not coming into Israel is somehow a discrimination against Arab citizens of Israel is obviously nonsense. Refugees aren't allowed automatically into any country, and that's not a discrimination against an ethnic group within that country. This line about people not being allowed to marry is also nonsense. What's true in Israel is that since 2003, the law that was the only one of its kind that I know of in a democratic country, where marrying someone automatically entitled the spouse to have citizenship, even if the citizenship of the spouse was of an enemy nationality. That doesn't exist in Israel. That's equally true in every other country in the world. There is no country in the world that gives an automatic citizenship to somebody on the basis of being married to one of its own citizens, and absolutely no country that does it in a situation of war. In regard to the territories, of course the situation in the territories is difficult. To discuss the occupation without talking about how it came about and what sustains it is to totally pervert the discussion. The territories are occupied because Israel won a war where it was threatened with destruction, and the occupation is sustained for 50 years because at no point has the other side agreed to make peace. The occupation could end today with a peace agreement on two states, but it was the Palestinian leadership that rejected the possibility of two states in 2000 and in 2001 in Camp David and Dahaba, rejected it again in 2007 in Annapolis in 2008, rejected it again in 2013 and 14 in Washington, in the secret talks in London and in the talks that were mediated by John Kerry. That could end in a moment with a peace agreement. And the situation in Gaza, to describe it even as occupied, is to stretch the bounds of these legal definitions beyond anything that they're intended for. There's never been in history a territory that's called occupied where the belligerent army that's supposedly occupying it has exactly 0 troops in it. What is in Gaza is a blockade, which is a perfectly normal act in a state of war. In fact, in almost every war where there has been the possibility for one side to impose a blockade on the other as long as the war was ongoing, that's been the reality. A blockade could be ended in Gaza the exact same way that the occupation could be ended in the West Bank, with a peace agreement.
We're going to have to leave it at that, you guys, but thank you so much for...
I just finished a debate on Rising, where the segment ended immediately after Shany Mor said many things that were demonstrably false, and I did not get a chance to respond, so here's a quick follow-up. First, he said that Israel not letting in Palestinian refugees was not discrimination. But consider the fact that these are Palestinians who became refugees because of Israel's ethnic cleansing. They drove them from their homes, and what these refugees want is to return to those homes. So you have a situation in which Israel lets anybody in the world who is Jewish move to Israel, but doesn't let Palestinians that they drove out move back to their homes. If that is not discrimination, I don't know what is. The same is true of the marriage discrimination, where a Jewish Israeli can marry a Jewish person from anywhere in the world, and that person can then move to Israel and gain citizenship, including marrying a Jewish settler in the occupied West Bank. But if a Palestinian citizen of Israel marries a Palestinian from the very same occupied West Bank, that Palestinian is not allowed to move to Tel Aviv and is not allowed to gain citizenship. And then the biggest inversion of reality of them all is the question of who is responsible for the absence of peace. Palestinians made a massive compromise for the sake of peace when they accepted the two-state solution, settling for a Palestinian state on just 22% of their historic homeland. And all Israel had to do is withdraw from these tiny areas, as they are obligated to under international law, and allow for a Palestinian state to exist. But what Israel did throughout the so-called peace process is, instead of withdrawing, they kept expanding in those areas, building more and more illegal settlements, making a Palestinian state impossible to emerge. What Palestinians were offered were tiny and isolated pieces of land that were under the complete and total control of the Israeli military, and they were told they could call that a state. Palestinians naturally rejected that offer because it does not allow them to live free lives as equal human beings with full rights like anybody else in the world. But if I had just 30 more seconds to respond, I would have simply asked Shany whether he would accept to live along with millions of Israelis in tiny and isolated pieces of land that are under the complete control of Palestinians. Of course he would not. But the reason why he thinks this is a generous offer that Palestinians should have accepted is because he does not see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same freedom and rights that Israelis enjoy. And that has always been the fundamental problem under Israeli apartheid.